If they had to work with one justice other than the one you had, in this case Chief Justice Vinson, who would you select and why?
If you really wanted a rather profound, kind of, let me say, jurisprudential experience, Frankfurter would, I think, be a very real one. I mean, he sees these cases not only in a practical vein, but in a broader academic vein, likes to think about them and
Right.
get his clerks to learn, and sometimes gives his clerks very fascinating assignments that have very little to do with any particular case. Frankfurter would have been out for me because he always chose Harvard people, recommended by Paul Freund then, although his one exception was a Penn student whom I had taught when I was very green, wet behind the ears at Penn, named Anthony Amsterdam, Tony Amsterdam.
It's a pretty good exception.
For 2 terms.
Right.
On the school segregation issue, yesterday we talked about that which was approached during the 51 term. We talked about Felix Frankfurter coming to lunch and giving his feelings of why it should be put over.
For reasons that have been discussed already, this one was a hot potato. I don't think the court was of an even mind. I think many members of the court were probably very uncertain as to what to do. They were of 2 minds. I do remember having one small conversation with the chief on this. It was during the 2nd year, and it was, when I was about to leave, so I felt a little more licensed to open up a subject with him. It seems to me that there's a great moral issue at stake in these cases. I said, we have to think about morally, what do we owe every human being, something like that. And he paused. He wanted to put this fire out, but he said, well, on the other hand, would it be moral to start a lot of violence in this country? And I always thought, that was an interesting answer. Mm-hmm. I'm a lapsed Quaker, but I do go to meeting now and then, and I sort of put the question to the meeting. When doing the right thing means stirring up maybe a very terrible storm, right. Harm, what do you do? I guess that's a theme of a lot of literature, too.
If you had to you left in the summer of 53, and the case itself was really percolating along now. If you had to suspect in that time frame, take a snapshot, how the vote would go, how do you think it would go, and who would be voting for and against?
Well, I guess I thought about that a little. I figured Black, Douglas, probably Jackson, probably Frankfurter reluctantly, just because Felix never wanted to get into all these kinds of cases. And someone else, there must be a majority there. Mm-hmm. And that the others probably were reluctant, but maybe against it. They didn't want to overrule Plessy versus Ferguson, right. But maybe they didn't want to reaffirm Plessy so much as they didn't want to get into the effects of overruling it.
Let's back up a little bit. I mean, they had a whole week of argument in December of 52, and they had a conference in December of 52.
Right.
and then it carries through the spring, and at the end of the term, they propound the questions
Right.
and call for additional briefing. So
Yeah.
what were you privy to, and what do you recall of that sequence?
Alex Bickle, who was an outstanding clerk, of course, and really a very warm friend, and I talked about these things, and it became very clear to me that it was Frankfurter's office that drafted these questions, and persuaded the court that this would be at least a good way to rationalize putting the cases over for another term. I thought the questions were very intelligent. I thought that in my immature, unexperienced mind, but I thought the cases had not been well argued, particularly with all due respect to John W. Davis, and that you needed to get into very much, in a very serious way, the issues that were suggested by those questions. How do we interpret the 14th Amendment in respect of these racial equality issues in light of the vastly changed circumstances of government today? In Plessy's time, even, education was not regarded really, certainly in many parts of the country, as an absolutely sort of essential thing to get ahead in society.
Right. And not much of a government function.
Not much of a government function. In fact, I thought, well, it'd be interesting if somebody could go back and how many public schools were there in the U.S., in the South, and so on at that time. And my impression would be, well, public education still was in its infancy, in spite of efforts in the earlier part of the 19th century to get it started, Massachusetts and so on a systematic scale. And that, of course, found its way into Warren's opinion. It could have found its way in a more, as many things could have, in a more disciplined way. He could have, in a footnote, given some picture of this, which I think is so terribly important. That we're talking about something very different now. And the question is how to apply the Equal Protection Clause to this situation, not a situation as it existed then, and so on. The intentions of the framers, that's sort of a ridiculous question. It always seemed to me, how can the framers of an amendment have intentions? Or it's the same thing as how can Congress, but sometimes you can find out whether education was one of the real concerns. It doesn't appear to me that the history reveals that. At least Alex did then research the history, as you know, and parlayed them into wonderful academic stuff.
Right. Well, what had happened back in December of '52 in the conference? I mean, you clerks must have been you're aware that segregation's a huge case.
Oh, sure.
The justices go into conference, they've got, the 5 cases, the 4 state cases, plus Bowling versus Sharp.
Yeah.
And then, time passes. Didn't you sniff around for what had happened? Did you know what had happened?
I think it was very much as was discussed here by this class of law clerks, that there was no conversation between justice and clerks about this. I think the court had, they'd agreed to solemn, absolute silence on this, only in the conference room, which was probably a wise policy, because in a matter like this,
right,
maintaining security and confidence isn't. I remember I heard it on the radio. I started honking my horn all the way down the driveway as I came. Peggy came out and I told her the good news.